Good morning. I'd like to begin by thanking the organizers of the 2020 ATS online convention for allowing me to present this presentation. We're going to be looking at images of telescopes in unfamiliar places to explore the question, can they be used for doing the history of the telescope? What do we have to do to use these things? And before we can use them, how can we understand them in their context? So I will begin with your indulgence. Iconographical sources, that is, pictures, are important for the history of astronomical optics. They complement textual sources and artifacts, but they're particularly valuable when there are few or no extant artifacts. And I can also say, who wants to look at a book on telescopes which has no pictures? So here's an image of an early astronomical telescope from a book. And this is a wonderful image. It's particularly informative because it's so detailed. This is from Christoph Scheiner's Rosa Ursina. Roger has worked on this, and of course Christoph Scheiner. What this shows is one of Scheiner's telescopes for recording sunspots. There are other illustrations of this in his book. Now, this is an example of something I've said above. None of these early 17th century telescopes that we know of, none of them which were purpose-made for observing sunspots actually survive. Now, it's possible that some of the ones that do survive were used for that, but we don't know. And certainly, this arrangement for drawing the sunspots, for projecting the image of the sun, so you can draw it there, that sort of box does not survive. And it's unfortunate that we don't have this sort of example from Leif's period of about 100 years later, because that would have been useful for his project. I think the design of this telescope is probably quite close to what Leif is talking about from the from the 18th century. Put that aside. So this is an example. This is such a detailed illustration that this, along with Scheiner's text, is probably sufficient to reconstruct one of these instruments, if someone wanted to. So this is one example of how valuable an image of technology can be in a book where we would expect to find a valuable image of astronomical technology from the time. Here's another image. Again, this is striking. When you look on the date of this, you see this is from the last quarter of the 12th century. And you should immediately say, that's very striking, and that's also very surprising, because as we all know, there were no telescopes back then. So what's going on here? Well, it's not a telescope. It's a sighting tube. And what it is, it's part of a nocturnal, a particular device for telling the time by the stars. And we're more familiar with nocturnals from the 16th century to the 18th century. But they did have them in the Middle Ages. And the sighting tube, well, if this also shows another way that images are important. It's a lot easier to stop. It's a lot easier to stop and note that you've got something interesting by looking at an image than it is through going through a lot of text. And if you're going through a data bank of late 12th century images, you will be less inclined to read closely, particularly if you're skimming, to read the text closely. But if you saw this image, this is like a signpost that there's something interesting here, at least interesting to us. None of these 12th century nocturnals survive, so that also increases the value of this particular image. Imagery relevant to the history of the telescope can be classified according to various criteria. But for this talk, I'm going to use a simple two-flavored typology. A, images found in the usual places, and B, images discovered in unusual places. And I have to admit, as a typology, this is completely unsophisticated and wholly culturally contingent. It tells us nothing about the past, but rather a lot about the present. And that's the point, as you shall see. How do I define the usual places? Well, they're publications we now consider the paper monuments of canonical science. So, for instance, articles in the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society, or similar publications by other similar learned bodies, or monographs by the heads perched on the plinths in the pantheon of the scientific revolution. That is, books and pamphlets by people like Galileo, Kepler, Hevelius, Newton, Huygens, and others. We can all conjure the images I'm talking about without seeing them on the screen. I don't have to show them because we've seen them so often before. And yes, these are important as witnesses to what scientific instruments looked like. But having said that, I am going to show some. There's one of the plinths. That's Newton, as you can all see. So on the left, we have an image of a singlet object glass refractor from Johannes Hevelius's Selenographia from the mid-17th century. Right in the middle, we've got the earliest image of a Newtonian telescope that was published and widely disseminated. That's from Philtrans, 1672. And on the right, we have the aerial telescope of Christian Huygens. I think that was first published in 1684, and as an Astroscopia, that got repeated for probably 130 years. Basically, the same image in encyclopedias, if nowhere else, which itself is interesting. The only thing that got updated was the observer's clothes, which is sort of neat. So, what about the other category? Images which occur in unusual places. Well, what's an unusual place? For this presentation, an unusual place is a location which doesn't immediately leap to mind as a commonly accepted locale for scientific illustrations. So in that light, we could be looking at, say, something like this. This is from a satire by Thomas Rowlandson, The True Method of Sitting a Horse, Mathematically Delineated, from 1809. Well, this actually wouldn't tell us much about the technology of late Georgian telescopes. As you can see there, we can't even tell if that's meant to be a refractor or a Gregorian telescope. Satire, after all. Or something like this from our current age, and this is a graffito. Rather a nice one. As it happens, we're not going to be discussing images like that, though they are worth discussing. They're more representations of science than scientific representations. The images of telescopes in unfamiliar places in my title refers to 17th and 18th century images of telescopes and associated apparatus in disciplines we would not now consider part of science, or genres we couldn't imagine featuring images of scientific equipment. The practice and content of science are not static, so the redrawing of scientific boundaries, it doesn't surprise any of us. Before turning to several examples of what we might find in telescopic imagery in now unfamiliar places, I'll offer several examples, informative for the history of technology, which are drawn from disciplines which are now no longer embraced by science, and genres which are now considered totally non-scientific. These examples are textual, but I could have chosen them from visual corpus, I suppose. Here's the first one. Fra Giordano da Pisa, a Dominican, in a Lenten sermon delivered at Santa Maria Novella in Florence on February the 23rd, 1306, said the following: "It is not yet 20 years since there was found the art of making eyeglasses, which make for good vision, one of the best arts and most necessary that the world has. And it is so short a time that this new art, never before extant, was discovered. I saw the one who first discovered and practiced it, and I talked to him." Close quote. And on the left there we have a detail of a fresco from less than a half century after, which shows a medieval figure wearing eyeglasses, probably the very type that Fra Giordano was talking about at the beginning of the 14th century. What makes this passage from the sermon so important is that this is, I believe, the first written indication, narrative indication we have of the invention of the eyeglass. And of course, the invention of the eyeglass is part of the prehistory of the invention of the telescope. And I believe it was Edward Rosen, the irascible Edward Rosen, for any of you who remember him, who first signposted this as an important passage for the history of technology. Next is Robert Grosseteste. So this is earlier. This is from the first half of the 13th century. Depictions of the most ordinary of technical procedures, which were once but are now no longer current, can be very difficult to discover. One of them is the cutting of a quill pen in the 13th century. It was such a common procedure for anyone who was literate, why would anyone bother to note it? But Bishop Grosseteste did, and he described it in considerable detail in a sermon passage. If he hadn't done this, we'd know a lot less about this common yet crucial component of the techniques for communication. Grosseteste, as some of you know, also wrote on astronomy and optics. So we'd know a lot less about how people recorded science in the 13th century if he hadn't noted this sequence in detail of how to cut a quill pen. So both of these are from sermons. And those are places we wouldn't think to look now. So how does this work? Remember I said science isn't static and boundaries are continually redrawn, and if that wasn't the case, we wouldn't have science as we know it. So, if you were lucky enough to be trained in the universities or studia generalia in the 13th or 14th centuries, you were most likely a cleric, and your undergrad training included a broad education in stuff we would now call science, and also stuff we wouldn't call science. So in the first category, geometry and astronomy, and in the latter category, well, you would go on to things that you would go on to further training in theology, and that was considered a science at the time. What the stuff of everyday technology was doing in sermons is well explained by my colleague Joe Gehring, and I'm going to quote what he said. Grosseteste begins with the literal meaning of the thing described in Scripture, and he moves from that to the spiritual meaning. His understanding of how one should appreciate the literal sense of Scripture is informed by scientific training. Like many of his contemporaries in the schools, Grosseteste is confident that the better one understands the thing itself that is described in Scripture, in this case the pen, the better one can discover the spiritual meanings, whether allegorical or moral, that are intended by God, the author of the text. Close quote. And there we have it. Whatever moral or spiritual interpretation you're going to end up with, your starting point was an accurate literal description of whatever it was you were talking about. If you didn't start with a good literal description, you'd risk losing your audience, wasting their time, and having them laugh at you, which I hope doesn't happen to me in this presentation. It's a very medieval way of handling text, and it didn't disappear with the scientific revolution or the rise of Protestantism or the Enlightenment. It was a way of dealing with texts which was still current when Galileo turned his telescopes to the heavens, and it's reflected in representations of science and scientific representations from the early modern period and on to the 18th century. And here's a fine example dating to 1762 from an edition of Johann Arndt's Books of True Christianity. This image displays an admirable engraving of a Charlian-type telescope. The work it occurs in is a Lutheran book of emblems, and I owe knowledge of this work and of this particular illustration to Walther Stefani's generosity. The image I'll be turning to next and discussing in more detail presents similar issues to this image. But before I turn to that, I just want to say that I really like this image, partly because of the virtuosity with which it's been drawn, executed, but also because of the actual realistic, what seems like realistic detail in the depiction of the telescope. The visual vocabulary, the way the telescope appears and is decorated, is mounted, really does remind me of, say, for example, the Zimmer, large as Zimmer Gregorian in the Dresden collection. Let's continue our exploration through turning to the image we're going to spend most time on. And it's from Franz Reinz's Philosophical Political Meteorology in 12 dissertations divided into meteorological questions and political conclusions, and illustrated with appropriate emblems. Augsburg, 1698. Even to me, this interesting book is a very strange production. According to one recent critic, Reinz's work was a traditional meteorological treatise interspersed with symbolical interpretations of atmospheric phenomena. It was scientifically well informed with regard to astronomy and natural philosophy on the whole, and Reinzer was convinced that they, comets, were important of future events. Well, astrology, even mild watered-down astrology, could still be a part of some science in the late 17th century. Reinzer cites or mentions Tycho Brahe, Maestlin, Kepler, Scheiner, Riccioli, Hevelius, and Lubyanetsky. The same commentator also notes that Reinzer may have conducted his own astronomical observations, which to me increases the value of his work. Another commentator remarks that Reinzer's book is a response to failing Jesuit influence in the highest state circles in Habsburg Austria, that around 1700 the Jesuits' internal policies shifted the focus of Jesuit scrutiny of nature from innovation to erudition, and that the natural, philosophical, and political components of his book don't stick together very well. In other words, his book is a book of his time and not of ours. So here's a larger detail of it. This image occurs in the final part of his dissertation 5, question 8. And the text of that question begins, on unusual and wonderful semblances in the air which are occasionally visible. Various unusual portents, whenever they are liable to appear, even if fairly infrequently, such as a whole army of whatever kind, or a charge of those in combat, mobs of soldiers and armed phalanxes, fleets between the waves with oars and sails, and things similar to these in the air, are known to inspire in mortals not the smallest fear of imminent, inauspicious events. In the present question, we look into such phantoms and spectres, especially into what they may be, what causes them, what they may denote, and what they may portend. The heading which precedes this emblem is Conclusio Politica Iacula ne feriant praevide, which is political conclusion, foresee the javelins lest they strike, and the motto, Praeludit Olympus, could be rendered Olympus foretells. Here we have 3 medium focal length singlet object glass telescopes, an astronomical sextant, an astronomical quadrant, a triangular quadrant, and perhaps a cross staff on the ground there. These are the instruments. None of them are referred to, even obliquely, in the text, and our astronomers are putti. What are we to make of all this? Before answering that question, and in the interest of more context, which is always welcome, I think we should look at a few images of astronomical iconography for more usual places. The one on the left is from de la Caille's Ephemerides, that's his predictions. It's the frontispiece, and it shows a solar eclipse up in the top right there, sort of thing Jay would be interested in, an astronomical sextant, a parallactic instrument, a dome with a telescope, an idealized version of the old building, the original building of the Observatoire de Paris, a personification of Urania or Astronomia, a bunch of Prutti, and a group of astronomers in the background who are dressed as if they've just exited the portico of the Great Library of Alexandria. And you should be saying at this moment, wait a minute, this isn't science as we know it. Yet de la Caille is one of our acknowledged predecessors as an astronomer, an acknowledged predecessor in modern science. Interesting. On the right, we have Jean-Charles d'Auteroche, his account of his voyage to Siberia to see the transit of Venus in 1761. This was published in 1768. Again, the frontispiece. Here we have a transit of Venus, a telescope which is pointed away from the phenomenon of interest, and no one is looking through it. We have a massive pair of dividers, a bunch of putti, Urania, Louis XV, depicted as the patron of astronomy, other personifications of the arts, seated, Mars, depicted as Louis XV's Minister of War, a bunch of locals. Why all the normal accoutrements of 18th century expeditionary science? This whole business, this is rather curious, because the way the science is depicted here isn't all that different from how it's depicted in unusual sources we wouldn't think to look at. Yet these are depictions from sources we would look at. Interesting. So I return to that question. What are we to make of all this? Can and should we use images of astronomical equipment from unusual sources to inform us about past technologies? And if so, how might we go about doing so? Well, the answer is simple. If the sources were part of the scientific culture of their day or were reflections of that culture, then they should be used. Plain and simple. In fact, in my opinion, it's irresponsible for us not to use them. How then can we go about it? Now, these are not easy images, easy sources to use. So 1, we should try to recover and understand the original context of the works, how they might have been understood at the time, and the function of the images they contain. 2, we should compare the technologies shown in the images to what we know of these technologies from other sources. The more and varied sources we can bring together, the stronger our interpretations will be. 3, we should treat these sources like any others from the period, applying whatever source criticism we habitually use when dealing with these texts and sources. 4, should the images prove to be unreliable for the technology they purport to portray, they still have value as witnesses to attitudes toward those technologies. So even if something is not an image of science, or if something is not a scientific image, it's still an image of science and has value to inform us about how science was perceived at the time, which is still of use. And with this, I conclude my presentation. Thank you for listening.